Have you ever wondered what meals kept American families going during the toughest times in history? When cupboards were bare, money was scarce, and survival meant making magic out of scraps, people leaned on creativity and a whole lot of courage to put food on the table. What's fascinating is that many of those recipes, once so common, have almost completely disappeared today. These weren't fancy meals. They weren't written in glossy cookbooks or served in fine restaurants. They were born out of resilience, crafted in kitchens where every crumb mattered. A single egg could be stretched into a skillet of hash. A few beans could transform into supper for an entire family. Even wild greens pulled from the yard found their way onto the dinner plate. And here's the thing, behind every dish was more than just flavor. These meals carried stories of railroads and farms, of whispered secrets passed down from grandmothers, of childhoods shaped by simple foods that somehow felt like feasts. They were lifelines, traditions, and tiny sparks of joy in the darkest times. Today, we're dusting off the forgotten pages of history to bring back those recipes, not to modernize them, but to remember them exactly as they were. From the humble emergency egg hash to the sweet comfort of 5 brown sugar apple rings, these foods remind us that survival once had a taste, and nostalgia still lingers in every bite. So, sit back, and let's journey together through America's forgotten table. But before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed, because here, we don't just talk about recipes, we bring history back to life, one dish at a time. Part 1: Emergency Egg Hash. In the leanest years of America's past, the egg became more than just a breakfast staple, it was survival itself. When families faced bare cupboards and empty pockets, they turned to a humble invention known as emergency egg hash. The name itself carried weight. It wasn't about indulgence or luxury, it was about getting through another day. Picture a kitchen during the Great Depression or wartime shortages. The pantry shelves were sparse, but there might be 1 or 2 eggs, a leftover potato, and perhaps some scraps of onion or bread. Mothers would take these odds and ends, chop them together in a skillet, and fry them into a golden hash that filled the room with the scent of hope. Every bite was a reminder that, even in the hardest times, a warm meal could hold a family together. This dish wasn't uniform. In some homes, it leaned more potato-heavy, in others, bread crusts became the base. If there was a bit of salt pork, bacon grease, or lard, it went into the pan, stretching flavor far beyond the ingredients themselves. What mattered most wasn't the recipe, it was the resilience behind it. Children grew up on emergency egg hash, learning that food didn't need to be extravagant to feel like a feast. For many, it was the difference between going hungry and going to bed with something warm in their stomachs. Today, it may seem too simple, too plain, to deserve a second glance. But back then, this skillet hash was proof that no matter how little you had, you could always make something that fed both body and spirit. Emergency egg hash wasn't just food, it was survival, creativity, and love served on a plate. Part 2: Railroad Bin Mash. Along the endless tracks that stitched America together, food often had to be simple, filling, and portable. That's where railroad bin mash came in, a dish born not in fancy kitchens, but on the move, in camps beside the rails, and in the hands of workers who had little more than beans, fire, and time. Beans were cheap, durable, and packed with sustenance. They traveled well in burlap sacks, making them a lifeline for railroad workers, hobos, and travelers alike. When the day's work was done, or when a train hopper found a safe spot to rest, beans went into the pot. Sometimes mashed, sometimes stewed, but always hearty. The mash came from the way beans were softened over the fire, pressed with spoons or the back of knives, and stretched with whatever was available, bits of salt pork if luck allowed, wild onions for flavor, or just a pinch of salt. This wasn't glamorous food, but it was comfort in its own way. Imagine the sound of the train in the distance, the smoke rising from a campfire, and a battered tin plate being passed around. Each scoop of railroad bin mash carried the spirit of survival and the camaraderie of those who shared it. For many families, too, beans became a daily staple during hard times. They were cheap enough to keep bellies full, versatile enough to adapt to whatever scraps a household had, and forgiving enough to last through long stretches without spoiling. Today, the dish has mostly vanished from memory, but its story lingers. Railroad bin mash wasn't just about food, it was about endurance, about finding warmth beside the cold steel of the rails, and about carrying on when the road ahead seemed endless. Part 3: Whispered Milk Gravy. In many American kitchens of the past, one humble recipe carried a name as soft as its taste: whispered milk gravy. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't rich, but it was a quiet comfort whispered across breakfast tables when times were lean. Milk gravy came from necessity. When meat was scarce, families relied on fat drippings, pork grease, bacon fat, or even lard, saved carefully in jars by the stove. Mixed with flour and thinned with milk, it transformed into a creamy sauce that could stretch across biscuits, cornbread, or even stale bread slices. The whisper wasn't just poetic, it reflected how light the gravy could be, barely flavored, often made with more hope than ingredients. Picture a farmhouse kitchen at dawn. A mother stirs a pan, watching the flour and milk slowly thicken. Children wait at the table, hungry, while the smell of warm gravy begins to drift through the room. Maybe there's a single biscuit to break apart and share, or just toast fried in butter, whatever the household could muster. The gravy gave it life, turning scraps into something hearty enough to face the day. For many, whispered milk gravy became more than food, it was tradition. It reminded families that even when meat was a luxury, they could still gather around the table with something warm and filling. Grandmothers passed down the technique, showing that survival didn't always look like plenty, but like creativity with little. Today, it may seem too plain to impress. But in its time, whispered milk gravy was a lifeline, soft, subtle, and steady, just like the families who relied on it. A dish that spoke in whispers, but carried the strength of generations. Part 4: 5 Brown Sugar Apple Rings. When money was tight and sugar was a luxury, desserts had to be clever. That's how 5 brown sugar apple rings earned a place on American tables, a treat that turned the simplest fruit into something that felt almost magical. Apples were dependable. They grew in backyard orchards, were sold cheaply at markets, and could be stored through winter. With just a handful of ingredients, mothers and grandmothers transformed them into a dessert that children eagerly awaited. The recipe was straightforward: slices of apple cut into rings, dusted with brown sugar, and fried gently until caramelized. The sugar melted into a sticky glaze, coating each piece with a golden sweetness that seemed far fancier than it was. That 5 in the name was both practical and symbolic. Sometimes it meant 5 slices shared among a family, sometimes 5 apples stretched into rings, enough for everyone to taste. During the Great Depression or wartime rationing, even a small amount of sugar was precious. These apple rings weren't just food, they were little tokens of joy, proof that even hard times had moments of sweetness. Imagine children gathered around a wooden table, watching as sizzling apple rings were lifted from a skillet, steam curling into the air. Maybe they were served plain, or maybe with a drizzle of leftover syrup if there was any to spare. Either way, it felt like a feast. Today, we might overlook such a simple dish. But back then, 5 brown sugar apple rings were more than dessert. They were a reminder that love didn't need expensive ingredients. It only needed creativity, care, and a little sweetness to brighten the day. Part 5. Dandelion Greens. Long before supermarkets lined their shelves with bagged salads, American families often turned to the yard itself for survival. Dandelion greens, the same weeds many pull from their lawns today, were once a trusted, nutritious food during hard times. For generations, especially through the Great Depression and wartime shortages, families gathered wild dandelion leaves by hand. Children were sent outside with baskets, tasked to collect enough to feed the household. It was free, abundant, and filled with vitamins at a time when fresh produce wasn't always available. What others saw as weeds, struggling families saw as supper. The greens were typically boiled or sautéed to tame their natural bitterness. Sometimes they were tossed with vinegar, a drizzle of bacon drippings, or a few scraps of onion for flavor. On farms, they often appeared in spring, just when pantries were at their lowest and other vegetables hadn't yet come into season. That made dandelion greens more than food. They were a symbol of renewal, a sign that the earth itself provided even in scarcity. Imagine a simple wooden table, a steaming bowl of greens at the center, and a family grateful for a warm side dish. There was no waste. Roots could be roasted for coffee substitutes, flowers turned into wine, and the leaves into meals. Every part of the plant mattered. Today, many people treat dandelions as nothing more than garden nuisances, but to those who lived through America's hardest chapters, they were a lifeline. Dandelion greens weren't glamorous, but they carried the taste of resilience and resourcefulness, proof that survival sometimes grew right at your doorstep. Part 6. Harmony Quick Fry. In kitchens where time was short and ingredients were scarce, families often relied on quick, skillet-borne meals. One such dish, remembered by only a few today, was called Harmony Quick Fry. The name itself carried a promise, bringing together odds and ends in harmony, fried up fast to keep hunger at bay. This wasn't a recipe written with precision. It was more of an instinct, a tradition passed through practice. Mothers would scan the pantry and gather whatever scraps they could find, a bit of cornmeal, leftover beans, a spoonful of chopped onion, or even yesterday's potatoes. All of it went into the pan with a splash of fat, bacon drippings if you were lucky, lard or butter if you weren't. Fried together, the sizzling medley filled the kitchen with a smell that spoke louder than words. Dinner was ready. The beauty of Harmony Quick Fry lay in its flexibility. No two versions were alike. Some leaned savory, with beans and vegetables, while others took a sweeter turn, using corn and sugar. What mattered wasn't the exact flavor, it was the speed. Families who had worked long days in fields, factories, or on the rails needed something fast, filling, and familiar. This skillet fry gave them all three. Picture a weary father returning from work, children already seated at the table, waiting for the pan to be set down. Harmony Quick Fry wasn't glamorous, but it was warm, nourishing, and shared. It carried the idea that even with very little, you could still create something that brought people together. Today, the dish has nearly vanished, tucked away in memory. Yet its story remains, a reminder that harmony wasn't just in the ingredients, but in the act of gathering around the table, no matter how humble the meal. Part 7: Corn and lima beans. Long before canned goods lined every pantry, one of the simplest yet most beloved combinations on American tables was corn and lima beans. Known later by the name succotash, this dish wasn't just about flavor, it was about practicality, nourishment, and stretching the harvest as far as it would go. Corn was plentiful across America, grown in fields from the Midwest to the South. Lima beans, though humbler, packed protein and substance. Together, they created a dish that was cheap, filling, and surprisingly versatile. Families could boil them, fry them in a skillet with drippings, or mix them with whatever scraps of vegetables were left over. Even a small bowl of corn and lima beans could stand as a meal on its own. During the Great Depression and earlier in rural life, this combination often appeared on the table when other foods ran short. Children sometimes tired of it, but parents knew it was dependable, two simple ingredients that could keep hunger at bay. If there was a bit of butter or cream, it became richer. If onions or herbs were available, the flavor deepened. But even plain, it was enough. The dish carried history, too. Indigenous peoples had long paired corn with beans, understanding the balance of nutrition they provided together. Generations later, struggling American families leaned on the same wisdom, turning tradition into survival. Picture a farmhouse kitchen, a pot simmering gently on the stove, the bright yellow of corn mingling with the pale green of beans. No extravagance, no waste, just food that filled stomachs and brought quiet relief after long days of labor. Corn and lima beans weren't glamorous, but they were honest, a dish of endurance, heritage, and hope on a plate. Part 8: Cornbread. Few foods carry as much history in America as cornbread. Simple, rustic, and endlessly adaptable, it was the golden loaf that fed both pioneers on the frontier and families scraping by during the hardest times. Corn was cheap, abundant, and forgiving, making cornbread a staple from the Appalachian hills to southern farmhouses. The recipe was as humble as the lives it sustained: cornmeal, water or milk, a pinch of salt, and if fortune allowed, a spoonful of lard, butter, or egg to enrich the batter. Baked in cast-iron skillets, over open hearths, or later in wood stoves, cornbread emerged hot and fragrant, with a crisp crust and a tender, dense crumb. It wasn't dessert, it wasn't luxury, it was survival disguised as comfort. For families enduring the Great Depression, cornbread could stretch a meal further than almost anything else. A pot of beans became hearty when served with a slice of cornbread on the side. Day-old bread was crumbled into milk for breakfast or used to thicken soups and stews. Nothing was wasted, every crumb had purpose. Beyond practicality, cornbread carried deep cultural roots. Indigenous peoples had long used ground corn in their cooking, teaching early settlers how to turn it into nourishing bread. Over generations, that tradition wove itself into American identity, appearing in Sunday suppers, church gatherings, and family tables across the nation. Imagine a weary family gathered after a long day's work. The table might be sparse, but a skillet of cornbread sat proudly at the center, golden and steaming, cut into thick wedges for everyone to share. It wasn't just bread, it was warmth, it was tradition, it was the taste of resilience. In every bite of cornbread, history whispered of endurance, simplicity, and the quiet power of home. Part 9: Crackling Egg Scramble. In the days when nothing went to waste, even the smallest scraps of food found new life on the table. One of the tastiest examples of this thrift was the crackling egg scramble, a humble dish that turned leftovers into a hearty, flavorful breakfast. Cracklins were the crispy bits of pork skin and fat left over after rendering lard. To modern eyes, they might seem insignificant, but to families of the past, they were little treasures, salty, crunchy, and packed with flavor. Tossed into a pan with beaten eggs, they transformed a simple scramble into something that tasted like a feast. Picture a farmhouse kitchen in the early morning. A skillet warms on the stove, the smell of pork filling the air. The cook sprinkles in the cracklins, letting them sizzle before folding in fresh eggs. The sound of frying, the golden color spreading across the pan, and the savory aroma made even the simplest meal feel indulgent. Children often hurried to the table, eager for a share of the rare treat. For many families, this dish carried more than flavor, it carried resourcefulness. Cracklin egg scramble reminded everyone that no part of the pig was wasted, and nothing from the kitchen was taken for granted. It stretched precious meat further and added joy to the otherwise plain staple of eggs. Though it may not appear in modern cookbooks, cracklin egg scramble was once a breakfast of comfort and ingenuity. Every bite was a balance of softness and crunch, richness and simplicity. It wasn't just food, it was a lesson in making the most of what you had, proof that even scraps could create a memory worth savoring. A table remembered. As we look back at these forgotten recipes, from emergency egg hash to cracklin egg scramble, we uncover more than food. We uncover a way of life. These dishes weren't designed for taste alone, they were born from necessity, resilience, and the unshakable spirit of families who found ways to survive the harshest times. Every skillet of hash, every pan of cornbread, every simmering pot of beans carried stories of determination. They remind us that survival wasn't just about what people ate, it was about how they came together. Families shared, stretched, and sacrificed, transforming the simplest ingredients into meals that comforted body and soul. In those kitchens, scraps weren't wasted, and meals weren't taken for granted. Even a single apple ring dusted with sugar or a bowl of dandelion greens felt like abundance when times were hard. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was memory, tradition, and love served warm at the table. Today, these recipes have nearly vanished, buried under modern convenience and forgotten by time. But their stories remain. And by remembering them, we honor not only the dishes themselves but also the generations who taught us how to endure, how to create joy in scarcity, and how to find meaning in the simplest of meals. So, as we close this journey, ask yourself, what forgotten flavors live in your own family's past? What humble recipes, passed down or half-remembered, still carry the taste of history? If you enjoyed traveling back with me through these forgotten kitchens, make sure to subscribe, because this channel is where history comes alive, one recipe, one memory, and one story at a time. Together, we'll keep these traditions from fading, ensuring the resilience of the past continues to inspire our future.